The week the mistress died, the house learned a new sound. Silence. No prayers, no wailing, just wind combing long halls and touching curtains nobody had the heart to draw. The master covered the mirrors, stopped the clock, and buried his wife on the hill under the magnolias that leaned like tired old women. The slaves were kept at the edge of the field, heads bowed, watching the tiny figure of the master's daughter clutch his coat as the coffin went into earth. Her name was Laia. 8 years old, small for it. A soft lisp turned her words into humming. She did not cry. She only watched, eyes hollow as if she understood too much or not at all. For 3 days the master locked himself in his study. No food, no whiskey, no company. When at last he came out, he was thinner, unshaven, and he did not look for his child. Laia wandered the corridors with her mother's comb and a broken doll, talking to reflections as though they might answer. "She keeps looking for the missus," the housekeeper Essie whispered, like the mirror swallowed her. Laia unsettled the staff. She sat in corners tearing at her hem, whispering in a language no one knew. Some days she laughed for nothing. Some nights she screamed when touched, like skin remembering fire. Grief in the master soured into resentment. The child had her mother's hair and eyes, proof of what he'd lost every time she looked up. One morning he came down the hill to the quarters holding Laia's hand. The doll's one arm dangled. Her bare feet were cold with dew. 2 men followed in silence. The master stopped before the women. "She'll stay here," he said. "You know how to tend broken things." Then he turned and left his only child among people who had buried too many of their own. No one moved. The air held its breath. Old Mabel, the midwife whose back had been bent by other people's burdens, rose first. She knelt and offered a wooden cup. "Drink, baby. You'll sleep easy." Laia stared into the fire instead. "Papa says fire eats people when they lie," she murmured. Mabel made her voice gentle. "Fire keeps folks warm, that's all." Laia drank without looking away from the flames. That first night nobody slept. The girl perched on a stool, feet tucked under her dress, studying the hearth like it might teach her. When the women whispered, "Why he brought her, why now?" Laia began to hum. Not a tune exactly, more a memory of one, the kind a mother sings when the words are gone and only the wanting remains. The room went still. Even the crickets listened. "Mama used to sing that when Papa got mad," Laia said, smiling faintly. Later, Ruth, Essie's quick-tongued niece, woke to a whisper at her bed. Laia stood there with the one-armed doll clutched to her chest. "Papa said bad girls get sent here. He said you know how to fix them. Can you fix me?" Ruth could only stare. Laia curled onto the dirt floor and slept, like someone bracing for a blow. By morning, the quarters had decided one thing. The child wasn't evil. She was broken before she learned to speak. Days found her a rhythm. She fetched water, peeled potatoes, watched everything. By the tubs, she splashed her hands and hummed. Sometimes Ruth caught herself humming back before shame stopped her. But there were moments no one knew how to hold. When the overseer crossed the yard, Laia's shoulders fell and her gaze dropped by instinct, not imitation. When he shouted at a man, Laia whispered, "Papa says you beat them till they listen." Mabel's stomach turned. "Don't talk like that, child. That ain't right." "Papa says it's right if it makes them quiet," Laia said, and blinked at their silence. She copied what she'd seen in the big house and called it normal. She pointed instead of asking, snapped her fingers at the little ones to make them move, repeated phrases without heat or context. "Do it proper. Don't talk back." When corrected, she frowned. "But Papa says that's how good folks talk." Still, mercy threaded through. Ruth once found her outside with the doll upside down. "Don't cry, Mama," Laia whispered to the ragged face. "Papa said don't cry. Who you talking to, sugar?" Ruth asked. "Mama's inside this one," Laia said. "She ain't gone. She just got small." "Then you keep her safe," Ruth whispered, smoothing the child's hair. "But Papa says small things get lost." Rain came that night. At the window, Laia drew breath fog pictures with a finger. "What you making?" Mabel asked. "A house with no doors," Laia said. "Why no doors?" "So Papa can't find me." The next morning, the master returned to the quarters. Boots heavy in mud, voice clipped. "How's the girl?" he asked Mabel, the way a man asks after a sick animal. "She eats. She sleeps. We do our best. Keep her clean," he said. "Teach her to work. And don't let her forget who she is." He turned away. Lia scurried from behind a hut and stopped in the rain. "Papa," she whispered. He didn't bend, didn't smile. "Mind what they tell you," he said, and walked back up the hill. "Papa talks to God like that too," Lia told Mabel, and something in the old woman understood. The child wasn't only repeating him, she was becoming him. The heat thickened. Work dulled into habit. Lia learned fast, too fast. She folded rags the way the older women did, hushed babies with a practiced sway, bowed her head when the overseer passed. But what shook them wasn't mimicry, it was memory. In doorways, voice flat, she recited sentences that didn't belong in a child's mouth. Mama said Papa's love was heavy. That's why she sank. Mabel told the others. She ain't simple. She's full of echoes. One evening, when sunset bled red across the rows, a boy spilled a bucket. Lia's small hand came down hard across his cheek. "Don't spill again," she said calmly. "Papa says bad ones get fixed that way." Ruth caught her wrist mid-swing. "We don't hurt nobody here," she hissed. Lia's eyes fluttered with confusion. Then the tears came, dry and shaking, like someone apologizing without knowing how. "He ain't here," Ruth whispered, pulling her close. "You don't got to be him." That night the storm rattled the roofs. The child sat by the door rocking the doll. Lightning flared. Her face glowed white and distant. When the thunder rolled away, Lia said, "She didn't sing right," and Ruth's stomach turned cold. "Who?" "Mama?" Lia said. She kept saying Papa's name. Ruth reached out. The girl flinched hard. "Don't hit me," she cried. "Papa said that's how you make it stop." "I ain't him," Ruth breathed. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The rain softened. Mabel stood in the doorway with the dying firelight flickering on her face. "She's learning what she's seen," she said. "We all do. Problem is she's seen too much." When the cotton bloomed, the master came again. The yard held its breath. He stared at Lia crouched by the fence, making neat rows of sticks. "What's she doing?" "Playing," Mabel said carefully. "Keeps her quiet. Looks like graves," he muttered. Lia looked up and smiled faintly. "Are you come to see my house, Papa?" "What house?" She pointed. "Where good ones go when they stop crying." "Who told you that?" "You did," she said simply. Something flickered behind his eyes. Guilt or disgust, it was hard to name. "Get her washed," he said. "She's coming back to the house," Mabel started to speak. "Sir, she's my blood," he snapped. "I'll not have her living like one of you." When he was gone, Lia frowned. "Did I make him mad again?" "No, baby," Ruth said, kneeling. "You didn't do nothing wrong." "Yes, I did," Lia whispered, pressing her hands together like prayer. "Papa says bad ones make him tired. I make him tired. Maybe if I stop talking, he won't see me." That night she sat by the doorway and hummed her mother's broken song, thin, cracked, full of something the room could not name. In the quarters, they watched the hill blaze with candles for the first time in months. "He took her back to kill what's left of her," Ruth said. Mabel did not answer. She only stared at the light and prayed under her breath for a house with doors, and the strength to open one. They scrubbed her clean, combed her hair, set her at the dining table like a small mended thing. Candles woke the big house for the first time in months. The master poured whiskey with a steady hand that wasn't steady. "You've been living like them long enough," he said. "You'll eat proper. Speak proper. No more foolishness." "Yes, sir," Lia answered, and the room tilted. She had used his tone, low, clipped, the one that made dogs flatten to the floor. He froze with the glass to his mouth. "I said yes, sir," she repeated, puzzled that obedience could sound like disobedience when it carried the wrong echo. He laughed once, a hollow sound that startled Essie in the doorway. "She's learning," he said too loudly, "taken after her daddy." The laughter didn't last. She followed him after that, not out of love but by gravity, sat cross-legged on the rug when he read, crossing at the ankle the way he did, rubbed her thumb along the rim of her cup, the way he worried the lip of his glass. When he left his desk, she shuffled papers into neat ranks and held the feather end of a pen, the way he held the barrel of a pistol, careful, controlling, sure. At supper, he spoke the blessing. She bowed her head with him and kept it bowed. "What are you muttering, girl?" he asked, uneasy. "I said what you said to Mama," Lia answered without looking up. "You made me love you wrong." The fork slid from his fingers and rang obscene on china. "Who told you that?" "She did," Lia said mildly, but her mouth didn't move. The housekeeper whispered a prayer that had no words in it. The master slammed his glass down so hard the whiskey jumped. "Enough. You hear me? Enough?" He set her in the old bedroom with the big mirror and made her stand. "Look at yourself," he said. "You ain't one of them. You're mine. You'll remember that." Laya studied the silvered glass as if it might answer a catechism. "She looks like you when you get mad," she said softly. His hand rose and stopped like a trapped bird. He did not strike. He turned from the mirror and from the child. "Go," he said. "Get out of my sight." Before she left, Laya pressed her palm into the dust on the glass. The print matched the one he'd left that morning. After that, the house learned a new game called obedience. It had rules: speak only when he speaks first. Move only when he moves, never ask why. She learned quickly. Too quickly. He woke at night to find her standing in the doorway, like a prayer that had forgotten its words. "What are you doing there?" he barked. "Waiting for you to stop shouting in your sleep," she said. And he hated the way gentle things could sound like knives. Essie tried kindness like a poultice, thicker soup, warm bread, a hummed scrap from her own girlhood. But Laya ate little and hummed less. Once Essie found her arranging silver spoons in pairs. "What's that for, baby?" "So folks don't die alone," Laya said as if it were obvious. "Don't talk about your mother." The master snapped from the doorway, fresh whiskey on his breath. "Then what should I talk about?" Laya asked. He had no answer that wasn't a wound. She began leaving small proofs of presence, papers squared to an angle only he liked. The parlor chair nudged back the exact inch he always corrected. The piano lid lifted a finger's width. One night he found a straight line drawn through dust across the yellowed keys, broken dead center by a small handprint. Scratched into the wood, faint but legible. "I'm still listening. Who carved that?" he demanded. Laya looked at the piano as if it were a window. "I thought quiet was what you wanted," she said. He poured another drink. The house smelled like candle wax, sour sweat and something sweet going wrong. Downhill, the quarters learned to listen like weather vanes. Light burned late in upper windows. The wind carried noises that did not belong to sleep. The slam of a door, a belt's quick punctuation. A man's voice rising and breaking, and beneath it, a thin, tuneless humming. Mabel went to the threshold in her night shawl and stared up the hill until the dark gave her nothing back. In daylight, bruises hid in long sleeves and explanations. "She fell," Essie said, face stiff with the effort of saying it. When the field hands brought corn to the kitchen, Ruth saw Laya at the table folding napkins, with a care that looked like fear taught to pass for neatness. The girl didn't look up. The split in her lip had dried to a dark thread. That evening the master sat in his dead wife's room with the mirror and a low candle. He stared at Laya's reflection instead of her face. "Ain't you tired of me?" he asked, and meant it in a way he hadn't planned. She studied the two of them in the glass. "When you hurt me, I sound like you," she said. "When I'm quiet, I sound like Mama. I don't know which one to be." His glass slipped, rolled under the vanity, and the whiskey bled into the cracks. For the first time since the funeral, he cried. Not loud, not showy, the way a man cries when a verdict lands inside him. The house wilted after that. He did not go to the books. He did not go to the fields. He wandered instead room to room with the bottle, and Laya moved in his wake like a tether. If he slammed a door, she closed one gently. If he rubbed his temples, she pressed her own small hands to her brow in imitation, as though the only language she knew was copy. Sometimes he slept at the desk. She stood behind him and whispered, "You don't got to shout anymore. Papa, I hear you fine." He would start awake, not because of what she'd said, but because he knew it was true. By August, even Essie avoided the big house. "It smells wrong up there," she told Mabel. Wax and whiskey and something metallic like pennies kept in the mouth. Mabel walked the yard's edge at dusk, counting the breaths she wasn't taking. "We can't leave her there," Ruth said finally, voice small with a fear that had learned to dress itself as caution. "He'll shoot us dead," Mabel answered, which was not the same as saying we won't go. That night the wind went slack. They crept to the parlor window, barefoot, skirts lifted from glass. Inside, chairs had overturned. Candles guttered. The piano sat open like a mouth. The master slumped with his shirt undone, a pistol sleeping in his hand. Laya knelt on the floor, picking up shards from a broken tumbler one by one, setting them in a neat circle like a child making graves. "You gonna keep pretending you can't understand me?" the master slurred. "I hear you always," she said. "Even when you ain't talking." Something in him broke that wasn't fixable by drink. He flung the bottle. It shattered against the wall. "You ain't her," he shouted. "You'll never be her." "I know," Laya whispered. "How you made sure?" Mabel's grip closed on Ruth's wrist. "We go now?" she breathed. "We go soon." As they slipped back into the night, a single piano key sounded behind them, one thin note struck by a small, deliberate hand. It hung like a held breath. In the quarters, Mabel lit a lamp with fingers that would not stop shaking. "Tomorrow," she said, though no one had asked. "Before this house teaches that child there ain't any voice but his." Outside, the magnolias shifted against a sky that refused weather. In the big house, the mirror collected the day's last light. On the piano, the dust line still cut straight as judgment through the keys. The print of a small hand sat in it like a promise. They waited for a night that wouldn't carry sound, a night with no wind to snitch. When the lamps thinned in the big house, Mabel and Ruth went barefoot through the grass, skirts lifted from glass, breath small as birds. The front door was unlocked. It always was now. Inside, the parlor looked like a storm had stalled and never left. Chairs on their backs, candles burned to stubs, glass winking in the carpet. The piano sat open like a mouth. Laya knelt on the rug, gathering shards with slow, careful fingers and setting them in a neat ring as if she were counting graves. "Baby," Mabel whispered, kneeling. "It's me." "We going home?" Laya blinked up as if waking from someone else's dream. "I've been waiting," a voice came from the doorway. "She is home." The master leaned where the lamplight didn't touch, shirt open, a pistol loose in his hand. His face was hollowed out, but his eyes were newly sharp. "She's mine," he said. "Always been." Mabel stood, old spine straight as a handle. "She don't belong to nobody no more." "You done left her with your ghosts. That's all." "Move aside," he said, lifting the pistol an inch. "No." Mabel's voice was a fence post in the ground. "You done enough." For a breath, no one moved. Then Laya stepped from behind Mabel and faced him, small and steady. "You can hit me," she said softly. "That's what you do when you love someone, right?" His jaw shook. "Who told you that?" "You did," she said. "Every time you cried after." The pistol wavered. Something in him saw himself the way a mirror sees, without mercy. "I didn't mean to," he rasped. "I know," Laya said. "That's why it hurt worse. The pistol slipped. It struck the floor and fired. A thunderclap in a small room. Smoke curled. Ruth screamed. When the air cleared, no one had fallen. The bullet had torn into the piano, splintering the wood. One thin note trembled and hung on and on like a thread, refusing to break. Laya didn't flinch. She rested her fingers on the shattered keys. "See," she whispered, "you can't kill what you already broke." The master folded to his knees, the sound of it dull and final. "God forgive me," he said into his hands over and over, to a God who hadn't been in that room for a long time. Mabel put an arm around Laya and pulled, gentle but sure. "Come on, child." "We're going." Ruth held the lantern high. The light jumped over ruin and made their shadows long. At the threshold, his voice chased them, hoarse, pleading. "Laya," she stopped but didn't turn. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he said. "You never do," she answered. And the words fit into the house like a key turning a lock that had never worked. They took her down the hill in rain that started without thunder. The magnolias shivered as they passed. In the quarters, women came to their doors with faces pale in lamplight. Mabel wrapped Laya in a blanket and set her by the hearth. "Can I stay here now?" Laya asked. "As long as you need," Mabel said, brushing damp hair from her brow. "He said I belong to him. You don't belong to nobody no more." The fire settled. Laya watched it without humming. Her eyes didn't look like a child's or a ghost's, just a pair of eyes finally done being afraid. Up the hill, the big house lit a few more candles out of habit and then remembered how to be dark. By morning, no smoke rose from its chimney. No orders came. No footsteps crossed the porch. The land listened and heard only quiet. Ruth found a new dress for Laya from good scraps and white ones. "Now you look like an angel," she said, trying to make the word mean safety. "Angels ain't born from pain," Mabel murmured. "They just visit it." That night, when everyone slept, Mabel stood alone in the yard and looked toward the hill until her eyes watered. She wasn't waiting for light. She was making sure the dark stayed put. Behind her, Lia turned on her pallet and whispered to the flames, "Not a song, not a prayer, just 4 plain words that sounded like the truth finally learning its shape. The shouting's over now." Morning came and the big house did not. No smoke, no orders, no boots on the porch, just magnolias holding their breath. The overseer tried to make noise stand in for command, but sound without a center only proved what everyone already felt. The hill had gone hollow. Lia slept by Mabel's hearth now, a blanket to her chin, the one-armed doll tucked against her ribs. The women taught her the small economies that save a day, how to braid a rag into a stronger rope, how to steal 5 minutes of shade without being seen stealing it. Ruth sewed her a plain white dress from good scraps. "Angel," she joked, and Mabel answered, "Angels visit pain. They ain't born from it." The child learned fast in both directions. She could shell a full pan without missing a pea. She could also stare at blood on a scraped knee like it was a color chart. When the whip cracked far off, she didn't flinch. She cocked her head as if trying to place a note. "That sound means folks being good," she said once, and Mabel told her, "That sound means sorrow," and let the lesson sit where it fell. At night, the hill made its own weather. Some evenings the wind carried what you could pretend was only wind. The slam of a door, a man's voice breaking, and a single piano key pressed as if by a trembling hand. The quarters learned to keep the lamps low and the prayers quieter. The master did not come down. He did not send for her. By the second week the story split. Some said he'd locked himself in his study to learn a new kind of silence. Others swore they'd seen him drifting from room to room with a bottle, and a voice that didn't belong to anyone living. Either way, the hill had stopped giving orders, and the place ran on muscle memory and the women's arithmetic. Lia found a rhythm between hands that fed her and ghosts that didn't. She fetched water, sorted laundry, hummed half-tunes. She also left little signs of a mind trained by a different house. Buckets set in a precise line only the master had liked. Tools rearranged so they faced the way he'd once insisted they face. Rats, the men said. Wind. But Mabel saw the pattern and felt the back of her neck prickle. When she asked Lia about it, the girl only said, "He don't like mess." "Who don't?" Ruth asked, more sharply than she meant. "The quiet," Lia said, like it had a body and a temper. She started visiting the hill. Barefoot, slow, white dress brushing weeds, doll under her arm. She never stayed long. When she came back, she would sit with her hands in her lap for an hour, lips moving without sound. "Don't go up there," Ruth pleaded once. "Ain't nothing waiting but hurt." "It don't hurt no more," Lia said. "It just remembers." That was when Mabel began to use a word she hated, half. The child's eyes were too calm. Sometimes when Mabel called her name, Lia would look up and tilt her head like she was translating. "That what she used to call me," she'd say. "Who?" "Mama?" The overseer tried to tighten the day like a belt and snapped it instead. He pushed for quotas. The fields answered with sullen cotton. The men moved like clock hands whose springs had been taken. Work continued because hands know what to do even when minds won't. But the shape of it was wrong. There was no center. A place cannot be run by an echo. One dusk the quarters heard laughter and went cold before they could call it anything but a mistake. Lia stood by the fire with a boy half her size, his eyes wet, a bucket at his feet. "Good ones stay," she murmured, plucking peas from a bowl and flicking the bruised ones into the dust. "Bad ones go." Mabel took her by the shoulders. "We don't talk that way here." "Then who do I listen to?" Lia asked, genuinely lost. "Us," Mabel said, feeling how thin the word was against a house that had trained her otherwise. She woke one night to the sound of humming outside. Thin, even, patient. Lia stood under the magnolia, hair lifting in a small wind, palms pressed together like prayer but facing the house on the hill. "What you doing, baby?" Mabel asked, pulling her shawl close. "Listening," Lia said. "To what?" "He don't shout no more." She smiled without joy. "He talks quiet now." Mabel let her in. She did not sleep. At dawn she found a small white handprint pressed into the dirt by the fire pit. Not ash, something chalkier like river sediment. She rubbed it with her thumb and didn't tell anyone it did not smear like ash should. Word went thin and wide. The big house looked wrong even in daylight. A white film of mist clung to it in the mornings like milk. The shutters were shut, but sometimes they creaked without wind. At the creek, children started skipping stones in a tighter circle, glancing at the hill between throws. "It's just a house," the men said. "It's just boards." The women didn't correct them out loud. By first frost, Laya had stopped answering to the name as if it drew from the wrong well. "He calls me something else," she told Ruth one afternoon, plucking burrs from her hem. "What's that?" Ruth asked, trying to make a game of it. "Nothing," the child said simply. And the word felt like a door closing without a latch. That evening, Mabel made her a sweet tea she could barely afford and sat her by the hearth. "You eat yet?" Laya watched the flame. "He don't like me talking too loud. Ain't no one here to tell you what to do." "He's still here," Laya said, and finally turned her eyes to Mabel's. They were too old and too empty and much too calm. "Where?" Mabel asked and already knew the answer. "Everywhere. There are moments when care has to turn into action or it curdles into fear." Mabel stood, joints talking, and crossed to Ruth's door. "Tonight," she said, "we take her to the river." "The river?" Ruth whispered. "Where they put her mama." "Where love stopped and sorrow started," Mabel said. "Maybe she got to see it to let the rest go. They waited for a moon that could mind its own business." Wrapped Laya's shoulders in a shawl. Walked the rows slow, past stalks gone grey with cold, and a ground that remembered more than it wanted to. The river held low light in a hard line. The cypress smelled like medicine and silt. "This where Mama sleep," Laya said, kneeling without being told. She drew circles in wet earth with 2 fingers, small, then smaller, then too small to see. "That's right," Mabel said, and felt her throat close. "He say he can't find the door," Laya murmured. "He want me to open it." "Don't you dare," Mabel snapped, fear making her voice a whip she'd never used. "I don't owe that man the key to any peace." "Maybe I'm the door," Laya said, and put her palms flat on the surface. The water shivered outward in a white ring, slow as breath. Ruth grabbed Mabel's arm so hard she would bruise it. The river took on a milk sheen, faint at first, then brightening around the child's hands like veins of light. "Laya," Mabel said, stepping forward. "Come back. He's tired," the girl whispered. "He can't rest till—" "You don't set him free," Mabel said, voice breaking. "You set yourself free." The current burbled once from deep, as if a body had turned over in sleep. Mabel yanked the child backward. Both of them fell to mud. The light thinned, then went, leaving only water the color of iron and sky. Laya lay quiet in Mabel's arms, breath a small hitch, lips gone pale. "He quiet now," she breathed. "He gone." "Then that's done," Mabel said, rocking her and not believing the river had ended a thing she'd feared would never end. "Thank you," Laya added, softer, eyes unfocused. "He say thank you." Mabel felt something inside her loosen that had been clenched since the funeral. The air changed, the way a room changes when someone slips out and shuts the door without a click. Lighter, still sad, but light enough to breathe. They carried the child home between them, mud sucking at their ankles, the doll swinging against Ruth's hip by its one arm. Laya did not speak again that night. She did not cry. By the hearth, wrapped tight, she watched the flames with a face that had finally stopped choosing between 2 voices. Up the hill, the house stayed dark. Down by the river, early mist began to rise, thick and white like milk warming in a pan, and the first birds tested their throats against a morning that might at last be able to hold a song. For a few days after the river, the air felt lighter, like a door had been opened somewhere no one could see. Work went on, water hauled, wood split, meals made to stretch. Laya slept hard by Mabel's hearth and woke with a small start each time, as if looking for a voice that didn't live in her head anymore. She spoke less. When she did, it was simple. "He's quiet now," she told Mabel the second morning. "He talks, but not loud." "Let him talk to the empty rooms," Mabel said. "You listen to us." The hill kept its hush. No smoke, no orders. No steps across the porch. The overseer tried to scold the fields into obedience. The rows answered with tired cotton and men who only did what their hands remembered. By week's end, the story of the master had turned into a shrug. Some said he was praying himself down to bone. Some said he had gone to the river and forgot to come back. Either way, the house had become a shape that made silence. In the quarters, little things went wrong in precise ways. Buckets moved from where a woman left them to where a man once insisted they belong. Brooms stood bristle up. A stack of folded shirts faced the shelf with their buttons all to the right. "Rats," the men said. "Wind." Mabel kept her jaw set and asked Laya softly, "You do this?" Laya looked at the neat disorder and shrugged. He don't like mess. Who, baby? For the quiet, she answered, as if the word had a face. She started drifting up the hill in daylight, down to the creek at dusk, never far, never long. She would sit in the weeds and build a circle of stones the size of a plate. What's that? Ruth asked. A door, Laya said without looking up. Sometimes he says he can't find one. You don't owe him keys, Ruth snapped more harshly than she meant, and then held the girl's hand in apology until her own anger calmed. Nights brought humming again. But different now, no broken belt, no slammed door under it. A single note, steady as a heartbeat, like the sound a house makes when it remembers what it used to hold. Mabel would step out and stare toward the hill. The magnolias shivered, though there was no wind to move them. Laya went thin in a way food couldn't fix. She ate because Mabel told her to. She drank because Ruth pressed the cup to her lips and would not move it until she swallowed. She started waking to sit by the threshold before dawn, palms on her knees facing the river. Why you sit here? Mabel asked one grey morning. He still asks, Laya said. Not loud, just always what he want. Sorry, she whispered, as if the word itself might bite. Then let him stay hungry, Mabel said. He can starve on what he's owed. Laya didn't answer. Her eyes had the old calm back, the kind that isn't peace so much as the end of struggling. When the first cold snapped the water into a hard skin, Mabel made her choice. Tonight, she told Ruth, tying a shawl tight around her own throat. We go again. Back to the river, Ruth asked, fear souring the words. Mabel, I ain't asking him nothing, Mabel said. I'm telling her what doors to shut. They waited until the fields went quiet. The moon hung low behind cloud, a dull plate. The cypress breathed out mud and medicine. Laya did not resist when they led her to the bank. She knelt in the same place as before, as if her knees remembered. Mama, sleep here, she said. It's a good sleep. Not loud. That's right, Mabel murmured and put a hand on the girl's shoulder. Listen to me now. If he asks to be let in, you say no. If he asks to be let out, you say no. You ain't a door. You're a child. Laya looked at the water. Maybe I'm both. Before Mabel could answer, the girl pressed her palms flat to the surface. The river lit from under, a milk-white circle widening out from her hands. Not bright, just sure. The mist thickened, went pale. Ruth's breath came short and sharp. Laya, she whispered. Come back, baby. He says he's tired, Laya said, her voice growing far away. He says if I forgive, he can sleep. You don't owe him rest, Mabel said, stepping forward. Let him pace them empty halls forever. Laya's eyes flicked toward Mabel and then past her, toward the hill no one had the strength to look at. If I don't, she said simply, he stays in me. The river burbled once, a low body sound. The white brightened and climbed her wrists like veins filling. Mabel swore and lunged, grabbing the small shoulders and pulling hard. Both fell backward into cold mud. The light thinned, then thinned again and slid off the world like cream stirred into black coffee. The water went dark and held. Laya lay in Mabel's lap, face grey with cold. He quiet, she breathed. He gone. That's enough, Mabel said, and heard herself pleading with emptiness. That's plenty. A long breath later, Laya's lips moved again. He say thank you. Mabel closed her eyes. That thank you ain't worth the air it rode in on? They carried her back between them, the doll knocking against Ruth's hip in a dumb rhythm. No one in the quarters asked what had happened. They only cleared the hearth and set warm bricks by the pallet and brought broth and did the things people do when a life has to be coaxed back across a threshold. Toward dawn, Laya stirred. Mama waiting, she whispered, almost pleased, and exhaled a small final breath that did not turn around for anyone. The world held still. Then day began anyway. They wrapped her in the white dress Ruth had sewn and a shawl Mabel had been saving for winter. The men built a box because they could, and a place by the magnolia because it mattered. No preacher came. Mabel said the words the way the old ones had taught her. We return what the world shouldn't have taken, to a quiet that doesn't hurt. The women answered with the only prayer that fit in their throats. Let her rest. By noon the air had changed again, lighter in a way that wasn't joy, only relief. Birds worked at a tune they'd put away. The river ran clean under a skim of mist. Work picked up because hands know how to honor the dead by refusing to stop. That night, Ruth woke to soft steps in the yard. Barefoot, unhurried, she lifted the latch and saw nothing, only the glow of banked coals and the shape of the fire pit. In the ash beside it, a handprint had been pressed, small, perfect, faintly white, as if dipped in the thinnest milk. Ruth ran to Mabel. "You see?" Mabel stared at the mark, at the way it didn't smear when she brushed it. She didn't speak. She only covered the ash with her palm, holding it, like you hold a child's hand to say, "I know you're here." In the days that followed, some swore they saw a small figure in a plain white dress sitting at the edge of the river at dusk, or standing on the big house steps where no one lived anymore. Maybe they did. Maybe grief teaches a place to remember. Either way, the hill stayed quiet, and the quarters learned a new custom. At sundown, someone would set a cup of milk by the hearth, and no one would drink it. In the morning, the surface would be skinned over, faint and white. "What for?" a boy asked. "So she knows," Mabel said. "That we heard her. That the shouting's done." The name began as a whisper, the milk child, and stuck, because it felt like truth you could set down without breaking it. Not angel, not ghost, just a sign on water that a hard thing had been ended by small hands. Up on the hill, the piano had one key that stayed a half-inch down, splintered where the bullet found it. On still nights, people said they could hear it settle and rise, one thin note as if the house were breathing in its sleep. When it stopped, a voice, soft, child-plain, seemed to say from nowhere and everywhere, "I'm still listening." Winter stepped onto the place like someone who knew the way. Slow, sure, not asking permission. Frost stitched the fence rails. The river kept its face smooth. Work went on because hands refused to sit in grief when there's wood to split and mouths to fill. The hill stayed hollow, no smoke from the big house. No orders, no boots. The overseer tried to wear a voice wider than his shoulders. It slipped. Men did what they remembered and nothing extra. Women learned the new map of the day, what could be left undone without punishment, what must be done because the living demand it. At night, the yard heard steps that sounded like bare feet and caution. Ruth woke once to the door's latch whispering against its iron, opened on still air and found a small white handprint in the ash by the fire, faint as breath and shaped exactly like the first. She covered it with her palm and didn't tell anyone that it didn't smudge. Stories pooled because emptiness needs explanation. Some said the master had locked himself in the study and prayed the skin off his knees. Others said the river had taken him the way it takes any heavy thing that won't learn to float. No one went to look. The hill felt like a room where a fight had just ended, and you couldn't tell who'd won. Mabel waited, then made a decision that was not bravery so much as housekeeping. "We go tidy the house," she told Ruth. "Essie, and 2 women whose names the ledger never learned. We open what needs air. We shut what needs shutting. We ain't there to save a soul, just to keep dust from telling lies." They went at noon, lamps in hand, though it was daylight. The front door gave to a touch. The parlor smelled like old whiskey, spent wax and something sweet gone wrong. Chairs lay where they had fallen. The piano sat with its lid ajar, and one key sunk a half-inch lower, splintered where the bullet had found it. Essie made the sign she only made in storms. Lord forgive what was played in this room. Mabel closed the lid and set a folded cloth on top, as if covering a sleeping child. "Hush," she said, to the instrument, to the air, to the memory of a note that had trembled too long. In the dining room, they found the silver spoons arranged in pairs. Ruth reached to scatter them, paused and left them coupled. "Let the dead set their own table," Mabel said. "We ain't fighting with kindness." They opened the shutters to let the light find corners the dark had claimed. In the wife's old room, the mirror still wore the dustprint of a small hand. Liars beside the master's, the 2 marks almost the same size if your eyes softened. Mabel lifted her apron and wiped them both away, until the glass showed only the women standing in it, tired and alive. "You think he's in here?" Ruth asked. "No," Mabel said. "He's wherever men go when they run out of excuses." In the study, the ledgers lay open to numbers that had stopped mattering. A coat hung over a chair. On the desk, a glass with a mouthprint dried to sugar. They took nothing. Touching what a man leaves behind can tie his knots to your own rope. On their way out, they set the front door open and left it that way. Let air do what prayer sometimes can't. Back in the quarters, Mabel kept the new ritual simple. At sundown, someone set a cup of milk by the hearth. No words, no wailing. In the morning, the milk wore a skin, and the cup was poured out at the threshold. That was all. Our way of saying we hear you that didn't invite anyone to stay. The name hardened into use. Milk daughter. Not ghost, not angel. A sign left on water, that some hard thing had been ended by small hands. The children learned to say it without fear, the way you say rain or Sunday or thanks. The overseer came into the yard one afternoon with bark in his throat. He kicked at a rake, at a bucket set neatly where someone had chosen to put it. He pinned Mabel with a look he'd never yet dared. "Are you running this place now?" "This place running itself," Mabel said. "We're keeping it from falling." He hated the answer's plainness. "I'll keep that girl out of my mouth," he snapped, and no one missed how he'd meant to say house. He left with his hat too low and did not come back for 2 days. That night the wind turned and music walked the fields. 3 notes from a piano that wasn't supposed to, separated by more quiet than sound. Mabel stood at the edge of the rows and listened. Nothing in it asked for anything. It was the kind of note a house breathes when it finally understands it won't be shouted at anymore. "Go on, baby," Mabel said into the dark, not loud. "You done your part." Ruth's fear learned different clothes. What if she's stuck? She whispered later, rolling a thread between her fingers. What if letting him rest left her wandering? "She ain't stuck," Mabel said, certain in a way certainty usually refuses her. She opened a door and stepped through. We the ones live in the hallway. Days made a stack. Work thinned, then thickened as seasons do. The men cut wood in a rhythm that matched their breaths. The women traded fatigue like a shawl, one wearing it while another set it down to laugh for 5 minutes at nothing. When fear reached for the little ones, someone put a hand on a shoulder before it landed. Kindness learned to move faster than echo. Once a traveler came up the lane. Boots new, questions old. "Heard tell this place is cursed," he said, all grin. "Hear a piano if you stand real still." He offered coin for a story. Ruth turned her face away. Mabel took the coin, pressed it back into his hand, and said, "Keep walking." "Why?" he asked, affronted. "'Cause some sounds ain't for sale," Mabel said. "And what you hear if you listen long enough ain't a curse. It's a warning." "Warning of what?" "That cruelty's a voice," she said. "And if you ain't careful, you'll learn to hum." He left before dusk. No one watched him go. On the first frost, Mabel went to the river with a candle and set it down where mud remembered. She lit it, cupping the flame with both hands until it stood on its own. A child from one of the newer families followed, too young to carry the whole of the story, old enough to know the shape of sorrow. "Miss Mabel," he whispered. "Who's the candle for?" "The one who ended a thing," she said. "She forgive him?" He asked. She let him go, Mabel said. "That's harder." They stood until the flame guttered and the river took its weak light and broke it into little moving pieces. On the way back, the child asked if the milk daughter was an angel. "No," Mabel said. "Angels visit pain. She's what pain looks like when someone refuses to keep it." The boy didn't understand yet. It was enough that he heard it, that winter was thin and honest. The big house slouched into itself. Vines tested the porch boards and were not stopped. Sometimes the shutters clapped once with no wind, the way an old man clears his throat and then forgets why. When thaw came, birds nested in the eaves where orders used to sleep. Ruth woke one night to hear the barefoot steps again. Not near, not far. She opened her eyes into the room's low dark and saw the shape of a little girl in a plain white dress pause at the doorway and tilt her head, listening to a silence that for once belonged to her. The shape did not come in. It didn't need to. It turned toward the hill and went the way the not-quite moonlight pointed. Ruth sat up, hands pressed to her own ribs to feel them move. After a while she laughed, a small surprise thing because the sound that used to carry fear only brought relief. "What?" Mabel asked from the pallet, already awake and not saying so. "She ain't haunting," Ruth said. "She's checking." "On who?" "On us," Ruth said and lay back down. In the morning, the cup by the hearth wore a thin white skin that looked like a quiet place finally learning how to hold itself together. Mabel poured it at the threshold and watched the little river it made in the dirt. Then she washed the cup and set it upside down to dry. "We'll keep listening," she said, "not to anyone in particular." From the hill where no one stood came the smallest echo of a single key settling back into wood. It sounded less like grief than like furniture, remembering the shape of a room after it's been put right. Spring came like a rumor, thin light, soft mud, a little green daring the rose. The river forgot its winter face, Birds practiced small songs and then, surprised, kept them. Work went on because nothing else knows how. The hill stayed hollow. Then the men with paper arrived, a wagon with a crate of ledgers and a tin lockbox. The overseer in a borrowed coat. A county man who smelled like starch and confidence. A preacher, with a voice already sharpened to fit a pulpit. They stood at the edge of the yard like surveyors of ruin. Estate must be inventoried, said Starch, flipping a leather book open so the sunlight could bless it. Property secured. Accounts squared. Which property? Mabel asked, hands in her apron, voice like a fence post set deep. He looked at people like columns. All of it. Ruth felt the yard stiffen. The children went quiet in that practiced way. They went up the hill first, the overseer leading as if showing strangers his parlor. The women followed at a distance that let them hear and not be heard. The big house gave to their hands the way a corpse does, nothing fighting back, everything heavy. Inside, Starch coughed at the smell. Whiskey grit, wax gone sour, a sweetness turned wrong. He made a note as if a number could hold it. The preacher stood in the parlor and frowned at the piano. He lifted the lid with 2 fingers and stared at the one sunken key, the splintered edge where a bullet had chewed its way in. There's unrest here, he announced, as if the room might apologize. It's called memory, Mabel said under her breath. They moved like moths in daylight, lost without a lamp to orbit. In the study, Starch found ledgers and became himself, columns lining up under his pencil. Livestock, he read. Implements. Notes outstanding. His mouth shaped the next word without saying it, the one that lived between the lines. The preacher started to pray in a voice meant for show. We cast out. A single note answered from the parlor. Not loud, just certain. The men stopped as if someone had snapped a chalk line at their feet. It's the wind, the overseer said. Though the windows were still. They went to the mirror in the wife's room and Starch bent to see if a mark could be made to count for something. The glass, wiped clean days ago by Mabel, showed only what was there. Tired men, tired women, a room that had remembered more than it should. The preacher reached to lay a hand flat on the shine. Leave it, Mabel said. Instruments of vanity, why, he began. Instruments of truth, she said. And he, surprisingly, let his hand fall. They set to listing. Chairs, rugs, candlesticks. Spoons paired. Sheets yellowing. A pistol found behind the desk. Rust crawling its barrel like ivy. No body to anchor the paperwork. Starch disliked that. His face pinched the way a ledger does when a sum refuses to behave. Absent, he wrote, and the word looked small enough to swallow a man. Back in the yard, he counted heads the way a man counts fence posts. Names mangled into numbers. Lines drawn where families stood. He did not look at eyes. The preacher murmured a mild sermon as if grief were a stain and not a weight. When he finished, he snapped the book shut. Auction within a fortnight, he said. Debt does not forgive itself. Something in the yard leaned forward. Mabel stepped into the space before it could turn into a stampede or a scream. A fortnight's a long time, she said. Children to wean, seeds to set. You want your auction to look tidy, you let us make it so. Starch considered the new math, neatness as value. He nodded, not understanding he'd been managed. That night the quarters gathered close. No wailing, no frenzy. Mabel spread a scrap of paper on the table and wrote with a stub of pencil the things the men would not. Who belonged to who by blood and by love. Who must not be separated if God or chance could be swayed. Who could bear to be moved because they had an aunt 2 farms down, a cousin upriver, a friend with a wagon. She drew lines like stitches. They will try to count us, she said. We will name ourselves. Ruth watched the old woman's hand, steady as the hand that catches a baby's first breath. You think they'll listen? They'll listen to money, Mabel said. So we make mercy look like thrift. In the days that followed, errands sprouted like weeds. A man happened to meet a trader on the road and planted the idea that a bulk sale to one farm kept assets from spoiling. Families intact cost less than grief scattered across counties. An aunt remembered a debt owed from a midwife's night 15 years back and collected in the coin of keeping. The overseer, eager to appear useful, carried messages without touching their meaning. Starch, pleased by the tidy bustle, marked check marks and did not notice that the check marks drew circles. The preacher did notice exactly one thing, the milk in the cups set nightly by the hearths. Superstition, he warned from the yard, keeps the devil fed. Mabel looked him in the eye. We ain't feeding nothing. We're answering. Answering to what? To the end of a thing, she said. You can amend that or you can leave. He left after sundown with a hymn in his mouth and uncertainty in his spine. The auction day came brittle and bright. Wagons, hats, talk. People stood like furniture for men to point at. Starch called names and numbers. Traders grunted. The overseer pretended to be a better man than he had been, and still the work had been done. Families were kept where keeping could be managed. Where they could not, hands found hands and held too long, whispering routes and names and nights to meet again. Mabel moved through the crowd like a seamstress, tying loops only she could see. Ruth stood by the children with a basket of bread and a voice that turned bread into a promise. You will not be hungry today. Halfway through, as bids droned and chalk clicked, the piano in the empty house spoke one low note and then another, as if the building were remembering how to breathe. Heads turned up the hill without meaning to. A trader crossed himself. Starch's pencil hesitated the way a man's heart does when he reaches for a stair that isn't there. It's the wind, the overseer said again, less sure. By dusk, it was over. Numbers tallied. Wagons turned. The yard held the shape of what had been and what was gone, both at once. The preacher offered a final prayer about humility and reward. No one lifted their heads. Prayers do not fix math. That night a storm came hard. Fast rain, sudden wind, like the sky had decided to help. It took the roof from the big house cleanly, as a mother takes a knife to a rotten cake. Shingles skirled across the yard. In the wife's old room, the mirror cracked from top to bottom with a sound like a last complicated sigh. In the quarters, the cups of milk were set as always. Lightning flashed once and showed a small figure at the edge of the yard in a plain white dress, bare feet bright with wet. She lifted one hand as if checking the door was latched, and then was gone at the speed normal things disappear. Morning found Ivy starting up the porch posts as if invited. The piano, soaked, would never take a tuning again. When the women went up to see, Mabel closed the lid for the last time. "Hush," she said, same as before, and laid her palm on the wood. "Is it done?" Ruth asked. "Not all at once," Mabel said. "But it's ending." They went back to the work that keeps people. The list on Mabel's table trimmed itself with use. One name crossed out because a cousin had claimed him. One underlined because the riverboat took a message upriver. One ringed with hope because sometimes that's the only coin you have. That evening, with the storm rinsed from the world and the birds not yet ready to sing again, Mabel carried the candle to the river as she always did. She set it where the mud remembered and cupped the flame until it stood steady. A small boy followed and touched her elbow. "Miss Mabel," he whispered. "How we know she ain't mad we couldn't keep everybody?" "We ain't gods," Mabel said. "We ain't ledgermen neither. We are people. We did more than we could and not as much as we wanted. That's the measure." The boy nodded like children do when they are agreeing with a tone and not yet the words. On the way back, Ruth reached for Mabel's hand in the dark. "I ain't heard the note since the storm." "That's because the house finally learned it don't need to speak for us," Mabel said. "We do the listening now." In the quiet that followed, the milk daughter did not appear. She did not need to. The river carried a skin of pale that looked like forgiveness from a distance and like fog up close. The hill let the wind through it. The quarters laid down to sleep, the kind of sleep that is not victory, only rest. Some endings are loud. This one was rain, and a cracked mirror and a note that decided at last to stop trembling. Spring thickened into summer. Summer went brittle and broke into fall. Work kept its stubborn clock. The hill slept with its mouth open to the weather. Vines took the porch posts the way patience takes a breath, slow, certain, not asking. The auction had emptied what counting could empty. What it couldn't, time handled. Wagons left. Some faces never came back. The yard learned new absences and folded around them the way cloth learns a missing button. Mabel kept the cup of milk by the hearth. No words, no bargains. Morning by morning she poured the skin at the threshold and wiped the rim clean. "We answer," she'd say, to no one particular. "Then we go to work." The piano up the hill warped with rain and heat until sound could no longer find straight wood. When storms passed, the house exhaled through broken shutters with a soft, uneven wheeze. On still nights, once in a long while, a single key settled with a low thup. Not music, just old furniture remembering a room. Men with paper came back through twice more that year. Lighter each time, fewer columns, fewer claims. They walked the ruined parlor and made faces like numbers had insulted them. Nothing left worth listing, one said. Mabel thought not to use seeds went in. Babies were born. Names were stitched to shirts inside seams where no trader could read them. Mercy learned to move quicker than the echo. When fear reached for the children, a hand reached first. News from far roads arrived without music. Men in blue. Men in grey. Lines on maps drawn by hands that had never carried water. None of it came with a calendar anyone here could trust. Still, whispers thickened into fact. Paper might soon say we were people all along. When the word finally touched their soil, it did not crack the sky or heal old breaks. It simply rearranged the arithmetic of a day. Some left at dawn and walked until sunset made a town. Some stayed because they'd buried too much here to be strangers anywhere else. Mabel stayed. She said the land knew her bones and she knew its meanness and, on a good day, its mercy. "I ain't leaving a place till it learns my name," she told Ruth, half a joke, half a vow. The milk daughter became a way of telling time. In fog that lay white and low over the river, people said they heard a hum thin as thread. Not a haunt, a reminder. New children learned the ritual without being taught. Set the cup. Speak nothing. Sleep. A traveler came one autumn with boots too new and questions too old. "They say there's a ghost plays the piano up there." He grinned, chin toward the hill. "You ever hear it?" "Once or twice," Ruth said, sorting beans. "But ghosts don't play. Houses do." He laughed like he understood and didn't. He asked for a story he could take. Mabel wiped her hands and said, "You go on and keep your asking." Some sounds don't travel well. He left before dark. No one watched him find the road. The big house bent, then leaned, then sagged. A winter storm took a wall. Ivy took the rest. The mirror in the wife's old room split again and fell in a long glitter that looked like rain learning to lie on its side. Mabel went up once, set the piano lid down proper, and tied a strip of linen round the case like a bandage. "Hush," she told it one last time. "Years make a stack." Ruth married a ferryman with a gentle back and a loud laugh and a scar he didn't explain. Essie moved upriver to a daughter with a roof that kept a tight promise. Boys who had learned to stoop learned to stand. Girls who had learned to hush learned to sing low songs that weren't apologies. Every first frost, Mabel carried the candle to the river and set it where the mud remembered hands. A child would always ask the same fair question. "Who's it for?" "For the one who ended a thing," Mabel said. "And for whoever has to end the next one." Did she forgive him? They'd say because stories want neat clothes. She let him go, Mabel answered. That's the only forgiveness the living can afford. When the old woman's hands shook too much to strike a match, Ruth struck it for her and held her palm around the flame until it stood on its own. "You think she hears?" Ruth asked once, eyes on the pale slick that milked the water near shore. "She ain't listening for us," Mabel said. "We doing the listening now." The day Mabel died, the river wore a fog thin as lace. They found her in her chair by the bank, the burnt-out stub of a candle at her feet, her head turned toward the place the water turns, even when you aren't watching. Her mouth had a small curve in it, the kind people get when they recognize a tune and don't need to sing along. They buried her under the magnolia with the others. No preacher, no ledger. The tree shed one yellow leaf like a benediction. Ruth set a cup of milk by the fresh dirt. The wind took its skin and moved it toward the river. Time did what it does. Took names from stones, took stones from ground, took ground from maps. The place got parceled and sold and left alone. Folks nearby built elsewhere. Nobody put a house on the hill. "Soil's pale there," they said. Won't keep a promise. The story didn't die. It just changed shape. Old people told it by cookfire. A master who broke a child because he could. A child who learned his voice and then unlearned it by ending what it would have made her. A river that turned white like milk when asked to hold two sorrows at once. They called her the milk daughter because the water remembered. Sometimes a stranger cutting cross-country swore he heard a piano, 3 quiet notes, and then none, like someone checking that the silence still worked. Sometimes kids dare one another to touch the water on fog mornings and snatch their hands back, laughing because fear is fun when it's borrowed. Ruth grew old and told it true. "It ain't a ghost story," she'd say. "It's a warning. Cruelty is a voice. If you ain't careful, you'll learn to hum." When little ones asked how to stop it, she'd show them the very small things. the hand you put on a shoulder before fear lands, the cup you set by a hearth with no words, the way you refuse to call power love even when it comes in familiar boots. Once in a year with too much dust, the river ran low and clear and mean. You could see the bottom where the white used to bloom. People said the place had finally forgotten. Then the fog came in one September morning without asking, and the water turned milk pale from bank to bend, and everyone in earshot, field hands, ferrymen, women hanging wash, fell quiet without knowing why. Let her rest, someone murmured, and the line went yard to yard until it was a net, catching every loose breath. That evening, Ruth walked the path Mabel had worn and set the candle in the old place. The flame lifted, doubtful, then stood, and the river took its light in little pieces. Ruth felt the years gather behind her like a congregation and did not turn. "You done your part," she said softly. To water, to air, to a girl whose feet had once learned 2 houses and chosen the one with doors. The wind moved through cane. The hill made no answer. It didn't have to. The quiet here had learned to hold. Some stories end in fire. This one ended in a woman who refused to carry a man's voice any farther. In a river that whitened and then cleared. In a house that forgot its name on purpose. What remains is small and daily. The cup, the match, the hand on a shoulder. The sentence people keep like a psalm when fog lays low over the ground. Let her rest. And because they say it and because they mean it, the night does.